Rate limiting is one of the essential features you need when you're thinking about securing your application, whether that's a Next.js application, a Node server, or anything that has internal or external APIs. In this video, I'm going to be talking about Unkey's brand new rate limiting package. It's a standalone package that requires minimal setup, it's globally distributed, and has features like overrides, asynchronous requests, rich analytics, audit logging, and so much more. So let's dig into rate limiting, first with a demo showing the latency that we are providing, and then we can actually see it implemented in an application. So here we have our Unkey rate limit demo. It has Unkey asynchronous, synchronous, and then Redis, and you can set the limit duration and then run tests on it. And you can find this at unkey.dev/rate limit. And basically the idea here is we have two options for Unkey, and then we have our Redis here. And as you can see from the chart, the Redis is consistently slower than Unkey would be, anywhere from 200 to all the way up to 600 or 700 milliseconds. Now this is just because it has a single source of truth. Instead of being globally distributed like Unkey is, you are going to be making a request to a server somewhere in the globe, whether that's in America, Europe, Japan, or wherever. This then causes latency because it has to go and send that across the network and then bring it back. With Unkey, we are globally distributed, meaning that your request will be processed at the closest place to the user. So Unkey asynchronous, essentially what we do here is we just don't wait for a response. And we can give you around 97% accuracy if you're using async, but you can see the latency is greatly reduced. So if you care more about latency than you do about accuracy, you can use the async. Otherwise, by default, we're using Unkey synchronous, which essentially just waits for a response from Unkey and then will tell you the result and say yes or no, and that will always be 100% accurate. And as you can see, the latency is still very, very small. It's only 44 milliseconds, making it incredibly fast, allowing your users of your application to move on quickly. So now you've seen what a demo looks like and the latency that we can provide. Let's talk about Unkey from the dashboard, looking at rate limiting, how it works. We can talk about overrides and also the analytical data as well. So here we are in the Unkey dashboard. We now have a new button over here on the left called rate limit. When you select that, you will be dropped into our rate limit section here. And as you can see, I have a bunch of different namespaces. And a namespace is essentially a way for you to set each endpoint to whatever you need. So in this example, we have one called email.outbound. We have an email.test, AI generate, and then this one called Next.js route demo. Now let's talk about this Next.js route demo. As you can see, we had a request come through. So if I click on this, you can actually see how the requests work, as well as the identifier here, which is an IP in this example. So from here, we have things like logs, which will actually show you the request, what country it came from, was it successful or not, and how many remaining of a rate limit they had. So in this example, 9 out of 10. With this, you can see if someone specifically is abusing your application, and then you can add filters as well, such as identifier, IP address, country, time, and was it successful or not. So you can actually filter out these log results based upon that, and I will show you one that has more results in a second. We have this thing called overrides. Now, overrides allows you to set custom rate limits for a specific identifier, whether that's an IP address, a user ID, an email, or whatever you might need, you can set this in here. And what it does is it allows you to set a custom limit and duration for a user. So for example, maybe you have a user on a free tier that has been abusing their usage. You could turn their rate limit down and we'll automatically handle for that for you in the code. So you don't have to do anything. Unkey just knows if this user identifier shows up, they have a specific rate limit and we need to set those and check those. This allows you to set those and not have to worry about implementing more code about checking for specific things or changing your code to add a new override. You can just set them as is. So in here, for example, if I did James at unkey.dev and I set my limit to 1,000 and my duration is this, when I create this, you'll see that it takes around 60 seconds to propagate, but from going forward, I can now do 1,000 requests a minute. And obviously you can come here and change them if you need to. But now, as a user, I now have these overridden limits. So let's look at some rich analytics while we're here. If we go to this AI generate here, you can see 5 days ago that I have set this up and I have 26 requests. 5 were rate limited for a total of 31. And the success rate for this namespace is 84%, because obviously with the rate limited amount here and the success, that's 84%. Now I can look out here and see that I have 2 different identifiers. One is user 456 and one is user 123. And as you can see, user 123 only made 6 requests, but this user made 25 requests and some of them were rate limited and some of them weren't. Then we could obviously change this to the last 24 hours and you'll see there's been no usage. So we don't have anything to show you. And of course, if I set this back to 7 days, we can actually set an identifier. So if I say user underscore 123, hit enter, you can now see that all you'll see here is the requests and the total and how their success rate was. So essentially you can go and filter down and figure out who is doing what and then look at that user as you need. So that's everything really in the dashboard. Now we should actually look at how this is implemented in code. I'm going to show you a Next.js API route and how that's handled, and then we can talk about how we're using these features. So here we have 2 routes. One is called simple and one is called audit logging, and we'll look at both. But this is how you implement rate limiting using Unki. Essentially, you create a constructor here called rate limit, and you pass in the root key, which is something that you get in the dashboard. You give it a namespace. You give it whether you want asynchronous or not. This is obviously optional, so you can delete this. You set the limit, and then you set the duration of the limit. And then when you need to use it in a route, this is an example of a get, you need an identifier of choice. So in this example, we're actually using IPs. We get the IP, and then we make a request to unki.limit, and we pass in this IP address, and then we wait for the response. So if I go to this application and go to /simple, we'll see a response back. We also have audit logging, which is here, which allows you to create a paper trail of the resources that are being used. So in this example, everything here is just the same, but down here, you'll see that we are using this resources. And what we're doing here is we're saying this is our resources that are attached to this rate limit. So in this example, we're saying type is framework, ID is Next.js, the name is Next.js, and we're putting metadata here as @router is true. And then we have a secondary resource, which is just a random UUID. So now if we go ahead and make these requests, so here we have our example. As you can see, when we go to /simple, we can continue to refresh this page. The remaining number goes down. You can still see success is true. And once we get to 0, the next time we make a request, the success is false. And now this user is being rate limited, essentially. What you would do is then look for success is not true, and then handle your rate limiting by just returning a 429, which we're not showing in this example, but that's how you would do it. And I'll show you the docs in a second. So that's simple. Then if we go to with audit log, we're now rate limiting again, so we can refresh a bunch of times and get false, and I'll keep refreshing. And then if we go back to the dashboard and we go to rate limit and we go here, you can see that now there have been some additional requests. And if I go inside of here, you can see 31 successful, 24 rate limiting for a 56% success rate. And then down here is me making requests. Now, if we go to logs, we can see that these were successful was not true, and we can use those to essentially decide what we're doing. But if we go to audit logging here, and we then go to system, and we go to rate limit Next.js demo, you can see now we have this rate limit denied. But if I click in here, you can now see the additional resource or the audit log paper trail that we created. So here is the Next.js, and here is the resource that we're also pulling up, which is that UUID. That's how the Unki application works, but how do we use this in a real world situation? So essentially the idea here is once you've installed our rate limit package, of course there is an API, so you can use the API directly if you're not using TypeScript, and there will be additional SDKs coming soon. You can then do something like this. You can make the request to your identifier, and then if the rate limit is not successful, you can just respond with 429 and tell them to try again later, or tell them they've been rate limited, or whatever you may need to do. There are many different configurations in our rate limit options here. You can set a thing called cost. So for cost, essentially the idea here is you can say, this is a really, really heavy operation on my database, and instead of costing just a default of 1, it should cost 4. So we can set the 4 as a cost, and then the amount of tokens a user has will deprecate that number. So for example, if you set this to 4 and they already have 8, and then you do 4 and 4 again, the next time they make a request, we'll reject it. Or if it's over the limit, we'll also reject it. If you need to add arbitrary metadata, you can actually do that directly on the record. So you can just use metadata and then set a record, and then of course the resources that you've already seen. Those are the limit options that we have. Of course, if there are more that you need, please let us know. And then we can talk about the API itself. So in the API reference, there's a rate limit, and it's under rate limits, and it's a post request. And here is an example of a full rate limit request. And then everything that you can do is here as well. So if you don't have a TypeScript application or a JavaScript application like Node or Next.js or whatever, you can use this as well to make those requests. So that's an overview of the brand new standalone rate limit package, giving you globally distributed low latency rate limiting anywhere in the globe.